Our guest speaker tonight is the Reverend Dr. Bill Edwards, and his topic is A Grave Situation, the Moravian Church at Bethel. Bill is a retired minister of the Uniting Church in Australia. He served on outback missions from 1958 to 1980 in South Australia and Western Australia. Since his retirement, he has lectured in Indigenous studies at a number of institutions, including the University of South Australia. His PhD thesis at Flinders University was entitled Moravian Aboriginal Missions in Australia. In 2009, he was awarded membership of the Order of Australia for services to the Indigenous community of Central Australia, to education and to the Uniting Church in Australia. His talk tonight examines the Moravian Church in South Australia, its origins in Eastern Europe, and Moravian cemeteries in Australia and overseas. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks for the opportunity of sharing something of what I've been learning over the past few years, and the experience I had up in the Pitjantjatjara lands for 20 years, and then being able to follow this up by teaching in Indigenous studies, and then in retirement undertake the study for my PhD. I wouldn't have been able to do much of this if it wasn't for the support of a hero, my wife Valerie. I heard a paper the other day by Valmay Hankel and Valerie Sitters. How many heard that? At the Geographic Society, on women explorers. And her definition of explorers was fairly broad, and she mentioned a number of people who have been out in various things, including the Camel Lady, the Robin Davidson. And I did ask a question at the end, because she had omitted missionaries and mission wives like the Strellows, and I thought they should have got a mention. And they said, well, they couldn't cover the whole territory. But I thought my wife too should have got a mention. She went out once with people on walkabout. She was a sister, and she wanted to know how the mothers fed their children when they were out in the bush. And they used to go out every year on walkabout in the dingo hunting season. So she went on the camels and donkeys for a couple of weeks doing that. So not many people have had that experience. So I just want to pay tribute to her in this. Why am I a Uniting Church minister and one who's worked with Aboriginal people, with the Presbyterian and then Uniting Church, speaking about this odd bunch, the Moravians? How many people have really feel they know something about Moravians? Come on. Well, there's a few, but not many. I divide the world between people who know about Moravians and people who don't, so most of you are on the outer tonight. Well, how is it that I got interested in this bunch? Well, as one who'd had that long-term experience in Aboriginal mission work, and I did some writing about it. I think I was one of the few who, in the midst of the thing, I kept up some study and I wrote about what was happening around me. And then, as I was able to enter academia, I was able to do more writing. And as I wrote some papers on the history of my own tradition, the Presbyterian mission work, I kept coming across these Moravians, because the Moravian churches, we'll see, were well known for their missionary work. And some of them came out to Australia, and they came under the auspices of interdenominational groups, mainly Anglican and Presbyterian. And so as I was writing the history of some of our mission stations, Marpoon, Weipa, Arakoon, that were Presbyterian, they were first opened by Moravians. So I was writing about them. And I got a bit more interested. I went overseas to Edinburgh for 7 weeks as study leave and did a bit more research there. And so when it came time for retirement, I thought I'd take these Moravians on full frontal. And that ended up through my study at Flinders under Brian Dickey. Brian apologised. He wouldn't be here. He's heard me give it at Flinders, and with history conference on, a lot of the professional historians are fairly busy this week. Well, to proceed with this, writing in the annals of the Association of American Geographers in 1971, Richard Francavilla commented that cultural geographers had published little on cemeteries, while acknowledging that historians and archaeologists have used analysis of style and stylistic changes of markers, gravestones or tombstones in their research. He suggested that insights can be gained from the following questions, which almost invariably are unanswered. What pattern are cemeteries laid out on? Are there architectural differences in tombstones in different parts of the cemetery? Are there architectural differences through time? Based on his study of 5 cemeteries in Oregon, he concluded that the cemetery in the United States is a microcosm of the real world. When I gave this paper at Flinders, I mentioned that giving it in that academic area, a little bit tentative, because I didn't have much historiography about cemeteries, and I felt I should have some models that I could bounce my stuff against. And I looked up the internet, cemeteries, historiography, and all I seemed to get was offers to bury me. And at my age, that gets a bit close to the bone. But I was interested to come across this writing. Somebody pointed me to this American man as a cultural geographer, and they seem to be the ones who have done most of the writing on cemeteries. Now, this paper focuses on a small countryside cemetery in South Australia. In it, I suggest that in line with Frank Villiers' findings in America, the layout of this cemetery provides insights into the history, ethos, values and traditions of a particular group of people buried there. The cemetery in question is in the grounds of what is now the Bethel Lutheran Church near Kapunda, approximately 80 kilometres north of Adelaide in South Australia, as you know. This church was from 1856 to 1907 a congregation of the Moravian Church, which had its roots in religious movements in Moravia and in the Czech Republic. First of all, in the Czech Republic in the 15th century, and then in Saxony in the 18th century. The paper examines the history of the Bethel Moravian congregation against this wider background of Moravian church history and traditions. Thus, we will visit 3 other cemeteries in Europe, America and Australia to trace the history of this movement. I've got a bit here that I've already said. How is it I'm talking about Moravians from Presbyterian background? Well, it's because of their involvement in the Aboriginal work. They had a reputation, the Moravians, for going where things were tough in their early days. They went to Greenland and West Indies back in the 18th century. And when the early missions here failed, people thought, well, perhaps these Moravians might be able to do something. They failed because of just the pressure on the people dying from the smallpox, from massacres, people being pushed off their land, a number of factors that meant that where first mission started in Australia, the people just seemed to disappear before their eyes. And so people turned to the Moravians, hoping they would have some success. I did this study at Flinders, and my thesis was Moravian Aboriginal missions in Australia. Now, when you do a PhD, you have people who are called supervisors. And when you're reading, you come across a lot of interesting material. And your supervisors say, you're being sidetracked, get back to your main thesis. And so, having completed, I'm off on the sidetracks now. And this is one of them. Mr. Dickey was one of those supervisors. And I pay acknowledgement to Brian and to David Hilliard and to others who supervised me there. I warn people, though, if you're going to do a PhD, if it's a male supervisor, make sure he's probably under 50, because by the time you're finished, he's going to have retired. And that happened. So you get shifted. And I got a female, and she was under 40. And what do women under 40 sometimes do? They have babies and have maternity leave. And so I had quite a few changes. So kind of get somebody in that range of about 45 to 50 or something, whatever sex they are, and you might be fairly safe. During my research, I visited places like Prague, Saxony, and Pennsylvania. While my focus was on the Moravians' role in Aboriginal work, I read of 2 Moravian churches established in South Australia. In a thesis on Aboriginal missions, these churches could receive only passing references. However, more recently, an invitation to contribute a chapter on the Moravians to the volume edited by Peter Monteith on the German presence in South Australia motivated further research related to these churches. And I've written about the Moravian work generally in South Australia. When visiting Bethel Church, I was fascinated to observe how the cemetery reflected Moravian traditions and the transition of the church from Moravian to Lutheran. This illustrated the way in which cemeteries provide historians with more than data relating to names, dates, relationships and other details. They also, through the layout and positioning of graves and the type of gravestones and memorials, illuminate the historical records as they portray the values and ideals of the society. In this paper, we visit 4 cemeteries at Herrnhut in Saxony, Bethlehem in Pennsylvania, Ebenezer in Victoria. I hope in a South Australian Historical Society I can cross that border, and Bethel in South Australia, to examine how the gravestones and structures of these cemeteries reflect these traditions. To provide background for these visits, the following is an outline of the early history of the Moravian Church. Moravia is a province of the Czech Republic. There's Bohemia, and where Prague is, and then Moravia, a bit to the south and east. Christianity was first introduced to the region in 863 by 2 brothers from Constantinople, Cyril and Methodius. The Moravian Church traces its heritage to Jan Hus, and many of you through school and other histories would know of Jan Hus, the reformer pre-Reformation. The son of a peasant born in 1369, he studied at the University of Prague, became Dean of the Philosophical Faculty in 1401 and Rector of the University in 1402. He was also ordained as a priest in that year. He was influenced by John Wycliffe, the English critic of the Roman Church. In 1994, I visited the Bethlehem Chapel, erected in Prague in 1391, as a place for preaching in the Czech language. This plain barn-like building with a pulpit and rows of seats contrasted with the ornately decorated Baroque churches in the town square of Prague. We've mentioned this church, and if you've been to Prague, there's I think St. Nicholas, the Reformed Church, the Tun Church, the Catholic Church, very ornate and memorials and so forth, lovely churches. But this church was built, it's been done up a bit, but it still has that plain look, just a preaching place and the chairs and not much ornamentation. And this reflects something of that whole movement. Hus preached in this chapel. He opposed the selling of indulgences, a practice introduced into Bohemia and Moravia in 1411. He promoted the use of the Czech language in Christian worship and preaching. And that had happened with those 2 early men, Methodius and his mate, earlier, and that again was unusual. And there's a tradition with the Moravians of interest in vernacular languages. He promoted the use of Czech language, excommunicated in 1412. He was tricked into meeting cardinals in Constance in 1415, was burned at the stake on the 6th of July. His followers, the Hussites, continued to meet in fields and caves, and in that part of the world they were sometimes known as the caverners, because they often met in caves and lived in caves. Despite persecution, the movement grew. John, an Archbishop of Prague, preached against abuses in the church in the same vein as Hus, and his nephew, Gregory, a monk, joined him, and they sought guidance from a farmer, Peter Chalchiki. It must have been unusual for prelates like that to seek advice from a simple farmer there. These talks led to the establishment of the Moravian Church in 1457. It became an official body. Thus a church exhibiting features of Protestantism was founded 60 years before Luther's Reformation. The group called themselves Jednota Bratska, I hope there are no Czech people checking me out, a unity of brethren. The Latin title, Unitas Fratrum, was used in legal documents. They turned to the Waldensians to consecrate their first bishop, Michael Bredikius, in 1467. That was a movement from part of France, spread across towards Austria, and again a bit of a pre-Reformation reforming movement. Persecution increased as religious conflict intensified throughout Europe during the Reformation. Following a time of relative freedom and growth later in the 16th century, persecution was renewed. Several brethren, noblemen, were amongst a group of 27 Czech lords, knights and burghers who, condemned as rebels by the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand, were executed on the Day of Blood, the 21st of June 1621. I'm sorry I haven't had time to put a photo of crosses, these 27 crosses, in the square, on the pavement, in the square, not far from that, as the place of execution. Very moving to visit that area. White painted crosses on the pavement of the Old Town Square in Prague marked the place of execution. Many Protestants fled into Poland and other nearby countries. Early in the 18th century, small groups met in woods in Bohemia and Moravia. A leader was Christian David, a carpenter, son of a Czech father and German mother, both strict Catholics. When working in Görlitz, he had a deep religious experience. Visiting his homeland, he met a remnant group referred to as the Hidden Seed, who sought to maintain the fellowship of the Unitas Fratrum. In his work travels, David also met Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf. How many people have heard of Zinzendorf? He should be fairly well known. If you went to church as a kid, you probably heard a story about him in a children's talk. So he met a German pietist who invited him to seek refuge on his estate in nearby Saxony. In 1722, two families led by David fled at night into Saxony, where they were welcomed by John Heitz, caretaker of Zinzendorf's estate. Now, pietism was a movement influenced by Philip Spener, who pastored Lutheran churches in Frankfurt and Dresden. Dresden, of course, is a little bit west of the area we're going to talk about in a minute. Spener advocated a simple religion of the heart with emphasis on Bible reading, the priesthood of believers, the need for a second birth and fellowship. August Franke, 1663 to 1727, a professor at the University of Halle, gave academic leadership to the movement, encouraging it to remain within the Lutheran Church. He also initiated foreign mission work, the Danish Halle Mission, founded in 1705. Zinzendorf, born 1700, was educated at Franke's Halle School. In 1719, he underwent a deep spiritual experience when visiting the art gallery in Dusseldorf. Viewing the painting Ecce Homo by Domenico Fetti with its crown of thorns and an inscription, "All this I did for thee, what doest thou for me?" He prayed that he would be drawn into the fellowship of his sufferings. You probably heard that story in a Sunday school address, I guess, many years ago. I certainly did. In 1721, Zinzendorf purchased land from his grandmother, who was only 21 then, to establish his estate at Berthelsdorf, east of Dresden. Now we're coming to the Hutburg cemetery. Zinzendorf was absent when the refugees arrived, but he warmly welcomed them on his return in December 1722. John Heitz climbed a basalt rock hill named the Hutburg, southwest of Berthelsdorf, only about 1.5 kilometres away, to select the site for a village. Heitz named the village Herrenhut from the phrase unter des Herrenhut, and sorry Con, my pronunciation's probably terrible, variously translated as under the Lord's protection or on watch for the Lord. Returning to Moravia, David led other brethren to this refuge. This model of building a Christian community for oppressed and refugee people influenced the later missionary activities of the Moravians. Zinzendorf brought together the traditions of Moravian zeal, practical service, most of them were peasants and artisan people, and simplicity. But with that he brought the devotion and scholarship of German pietism, and also his commitment to worldwide mission. There's a story that as a count he was invited to the wedding of a prince of Denmark. I don't think it was Hamlet, but another one. And there were a couple of, from that early Danish mission in the West Indies, a couple of converts. men of African descent who were there from the West Indies, and they spoke to Zinzendorf and said, send us more people to teach us. And that really got at him, and he became a great advocate for worldwide mission. An experience during Holy Communion on 13th of August 1727, described as a realisation of the presence of the Lord and a baptism of his Spirit, was celebrated as the beginning of the renewed Unitas Fratrum. Zinzendorf viewed this as a fellowship within the Lutheran Church. He didn't want to make it a separate denomination. However, internal and external pressures led in 1742 to recognition of the movement as a separate church. As Christians dissatisfied with established churches in Saxony, Prussia and other European countries were attracted to the movement, membership increased. It'd be a bit like sometimes people leave our Uniting Church to join some charismatic. It'd be very similar, I think, to that kind of process. Moravian missionaries went to the West Indies and Greenland. Their mission work spread to North, Central and South America and to South Africa, East Africa, the Gold Coast, Tibet, Jerusalem and other lands. When I was doing this research in England and Germany back in the 90s and dealing with statistics, half the Moravian Church membership in the world was in Tanzania, of all places. The membership was about 550,000 and half of them were there. It seemed to be the one place where they put down roots and the people accepted it and they began a Moravian kind of synod, whereas in other places one of their principles that they worked within other fellowships as if to renew them, bring their special approach, but not start a separate denomination. Now, any of you have Methodist background? Ever heard of a bloke called Wesley? And you heard he had a kind of movement. How did he put it there? His heart was strangely warmed. Yeah. Well, that was at a Moravian meeting in Aldersgate Street in London. He was on a boat going to Georgia in America, and there were some Moravians travelling on that boat. And there was a big storm, and most people were scared. And these Moravians just continued singing hymns serenely, and Wesley thought, they must have something I haven't got. He was an Anglican, of course, then, and still remained an Anglican, really. And he sought fellowship with Moravians, and he had that experience in a Moravian meeting hall. Any Baptists? They would have heard of William Carey, who was one of their first missionaries to go to India, and the good Baptist in London said, the gospel's not for people out there, it's for good Englishmen, not for people out there in India. And what William Carey quoted, he held up a copy of some of the Moravian reports and said, we should be doing what the Moravians are doing. So he had quite an influence, they had quite an influence, and they also had quite an influence on Wilberforce. The ones who went to West Indies, they were prepared to go and live as slaves. That was the way they said, we want to go and live with these people. We don't want to be lordly to them, we want to be right with them. Now that was pretty difficult, and most of the slave owners didn't think much of that idea. But that was pretty much their philosophy. And so they had great influence on Wilberforce. The Moravians were active in England from 1738 and entered Ireland 1746. In America, they established strong communities in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania in 1742 and Winston-Salem in North Carolina in 1752. Moravians referred to this planting of communities in other parts of the world as a diaspora. Distinctive features of the Moravian tradition developed by Zinzendorf included a passion for mission, an emphasis on simplicity of life in the spirit, a commitment to universal education, a recognition of the importance of vernacular languages, the promotion of music and song, and in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, they have a bark festival every year. I only wish my visits had coincided with that. The acceptance of the equality of all believers and the implementation of a choir system. Zinzendorf encouraged members to write personal memoirs, Lebenslaufe, giving a brief account of their lives and spiritual development. 3 of these features are relevant to the layout of Moravian cemeteries. And in education, if you've been an educationalist and read philosophers of education, you've probably read about John Amos Comenius, very influential figure, and he was one of these early Moravians before Zinzendorf. Goes back to their time in Czech Republic, and then he was in Poland. Moravian communities were divided into groups named choirs, divided according to age, sex and marital status. For example, there were groups of single men, single women, widows, older boys, older girls, younger boys and younger girls. 10 such choirs, each led by an elder, were developed at Herrnhut as centres for fellowship, worship, singing, education, housekeeping and crafts. Groups living in buildings with names such as Widow's House, Sister's House and Brother's House. This system enabled women to exercise authority and maintain some independence. Jan Sensbach, an American scholar, observed, like a church within a church, the choir system provided women with a vital forum for religious development. Women lived and worshipped largely in a world of their own devising, not prevalent back then in the 18th century. The Moravians promoted an ethos of egalitarianism. Many of the refugees at Herrnhut were of peasant and artisan stock. Zinzendorf followed Luther's teaching of the two kingdoms, one of faith and the other of political power. The brethren were to submit to the latter in secular matters. The first constitutional Unity Synod of 1764 affirmed, "We're a people that stands under the immediate government of our head and Lord Jesus Christ, and thus we are neither a republic, nor an aristocracy, nor a monarchy, but a theocracy." All members were viewed as equal, as children of God. While encouraging education, the Moravians advocated simplicity of faith and worship, a radical simplicity in the spirit. They adapted liturgies from other traditions to distinctive Moravian forms. In this way, they sought to recover the simplicity of apostolic worship, as described in the Acts of the Apostles. These values and structures are exemplified in the Moravian cemeteries at Herrnhut in Saxony and Bethlehem in Pennsylvania. Moravian cemeteries are referred to as God's Acre, a German term, a Gottesacker, similar to that, a term widely used in Germany. This name, in the Moravian acceptance of the term, does not mean an acre dedicated to God. It means God's field in which the bodies of Christians are laid, awaiting the resurrection. The site that Heitz had selected for a village for the refugees was a marshy stretch of land at the base of the southern slope of the Hutberg Hill. More recently, the Hamiltons, father and son who wrote a history of the Moravians, described it. From its summit today, you'll look out over an entrancing scene, hill alternating with valley, field with forest, red village roofs with manor house and spire. Central to the village, which has a population of approximately 1,500, is the Moravian Church. The Hutberg became the site of the Herrnhut Cemetery. Frank of Italia noted that the earliest cemeteries were usually located on hilltops. Hill and mountaintops are deeply rooted in the Judeo-Christian heritage as spiritual locations. The first burial in the that actually is Zinzendorf's Schloss, or his castle at Berthelsdorf. Under the communist regime in East Germany, it just fell into disrepair, and it's a shame. Great historical place. I hope sometime somebody would do that up. The first burial took place 1730. Zinzendorf's first wife, Countess Edmuth Dorothea van Zinzendorf, was buried there 25th June 56. A year later, Zinzendorf married Anna Nitschmann. And Zinzendorf died 9th of May 60, was buried beside his former wife his 16th of May, and then his second wife Anna died 5 days later. That's my wife at the gateway to the Hutberg Cemetery. The layout of the Hutberg Cemetery expressed the egalitarianism and simplicity of Moravian society. The flat white marble gravestones laid at ground level bear the basic details of name, dates of birth and death. And there they are. A scripture verse and brief comment. Frank of Italy identified 9 types of cemetery memorials, referred to this as the lawn type. This is a plate, usually of granite or bronze, whose top surface is flush with the ground level, about an inch above it at most. That's a quote from him. There are no elaborate pillars or other raised sculptures. Typical of these memorials is that of Christian David, who died in 1751. The rows of simple gravestones express the equality of all buried there. The exceptions to this are the memorials to the Zinzendorf family plot, where the grave slabs are raised above ground level. This is explained as follows in a recent article. Only the graves of the Zinzendorf family and the governors of the community are raised, which due to the new division of the grave plots were moved and ended up inadvertently on the main path. So the cemetery expanded and people were walking over it. I suspect it might be something a bit more, because who on earth has ever really continued with an egalitarian society? I mean, even the Labor Party has problems, don't they? The distribution of the graves reflected the choir system, with males buried in one square, females in another. And I'll just leave out a bit there. According to a historian of German Protestantism, Nicholas Hope, Zinzendorf was the first person in Germany to design a graveyard as a friendly and aesthetically attractive garden of rest. Now we move to the Moravian cemetery at Bethlehem in Pennsylvania. The Moravian diaspora spread to North America when the first Moravian settlement in a British colony was established at Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, 1741. Bethlehem is probably better known for what? Steel. And that's now just wreck, the steelworks. But on the other side of the Lehigh River was this Moravian village with lovely stone Germanic buildings. It's church, college, seminary and archive. And this is the Moravian College there, where I spent a bit of time, 1994 and 1998. It was planned as a self-sufficient community in which property, privacy and personal relations were to be subordinated to the common effort to achieve a spiritual ideal. The choir system was implemented with groups formed for widows, widowers, married couples, single sisters, single brothers, children. As the system developed, each group had its own German-style communal building. For example, the widow's house, and that's where we stayed when we went there on both of our trips. Bethlehem's God's Acre, a large plot near the town centre, was laid out in 1742. The flat stones indicate that all were equal in death as they are in life. This was exemplified at Bethlehem by the fact that adjacent gravestones record the places of rest of David Nitchman, the founder of the settlement, Joseph, a Mohican Indian there, and a former West Indian slave, which I think was the first one. This was in stark contrast with the prevailing practice in American cemeteries of that era and for much later. Frank of Italy cited other researchers who noted that there were separate Negro cemeteries in southern Illinois, almost complete segregation in Chicago cemeteries. He said, congregation in death appears to be as much a reality in America as segregation in life. The Moravian Bethlehem Cemetery was a notable exception to these practices. Now we come to Victoria. The Moravian Cemetery at Ebenezer in Victoria. The presence of Moravians in Australia resulted from two different movements. Firstly, they were invited to establish Aboriginal missions. Secondly, a small number migrated to the colonies and formed two Moravian congregations in South Australia. And I've already said a little bit about their coming here under Presbyterian auspices. It was made a bit easier to get to Victoria because the superintendent, the secretary of the London Moravian movement was a man called Peter Latrobe. And he had a brother out in Melbourne as the superintendent, Charles Latrobe. So he's just got on his computer and sent an email to his brother in London and said, can you send some missionaries, mate? Oh, bro. And missionaries Tager and Spieseke established a mission at Lake Bogan near Swan Hill, 1851. What happened in Victoria, 1851? Gold. The whole place went into turmoil. Some of you think it's never stopped, especially in the football season. But it made it hard, and that mission closed because the people were leaving to take jobs that the other people had left to go looking for gold. So it closed in 56. The two men returned to Germany. Spieseke returned in 1851 with Reverend F.W. Hagenauer to establish Ebenezer Mission on land semicircled by a bend in the river, Wimmera River near Dimboola. It's fairly close to my home area, as I was brought up in a country store about 70 kilometres from there, the other side of Horsham. So I had interest in that area. Local Aborigines were employed clearing land, cutting timber, building, gardening, shepherding and hunting. A church building was dedicated and the first convert, Nathaniel Pepper, baptised on the 12th of August 1860. Hagenauer transferred to Gippsland 1862 to found Rummiuk Mission. Both of them were under Rummiuk under Presbyterian auspices. A new church building dedicated 1875. Spesikie remained there till his death 1877. And the Aborigines contributed money for the purchase of his coffin. And here are shots at Ebenezer, some of the buildings that are still there, and there's been quite a lot of restoration work on the church and so forth. There's still descendants of around Dimboola and Horsham, and when I taught at Underdale in the Aboriginal Studies, 2 or 3 of the staff there were descended from people from that experience. The graves of Spesikie and 2 of his successors, the superintendent, the Reverend Carl Kramer, who died in 1891, and the Reverend Paul Bogish, died in 1903, are situated near the church. Their memorial slabs stand upright in contrast to the traditional Moravian gravestones. An earlier grave, which has a large horizontal slab, that's Kramer's. This one, it records a tragic event in 1872. The Reverend J.H. Stolle and his wife Mari arrived earlier that year. She died in childbirth on the 16th of October. Buried with her is the baby, also named Mari, who died a month later. The change from this flat tombstone to the later vertical ones may be due to the difficulty in isolated missionary families maintaining Moravian traditions, such as the choir system. Their local support came from other denominations. Presumably, they tended to follow local practices. The surviving headstone of one Aboriginal person is raised vertically in the manner of the adjacent missionaries' graves. And this was a grave of Philip Pepper, a brother of Nathaniel. I've got a bit here that I'll leave out. Death was ever present at Ebenezer as the people succumbed to consumption and other diseases. They were buried near the church in unmarked graves. This may have been due to the Aboriginal fear of hearing or recording the names of the dead, lest the spirits be disturbed, and that's my experience amongst the Pidginjara, and those spirits would molest the living. Dick, who's ever heard of Dick? He's a member of the first Australian cricket team to tour overseas, the Aboriginal team that went from Western Victoria mainly to England. And he's buried in that cemetery, an unmarked grave. And there's been some research by Jane Lydon and others from Melbourne who have been working with the local people and trying to establish the whereabouts of different graves there. I'll just leave that out. Now, the Presbyterians later started missions up in North Queensland. And now we come to the Moravians in South Australia. The Moravians had a short-lived mission enterprise in South Australia. This was motivated by the gratitude of Victorians who appreciated the role of Aborigines in the Coopers Creek region played in saving the life of John King, the sole survivor of the Burke and Wills expedition. In 1861, in return, they proposed the establishment of a mission to provide protection from the ill effects of pastoral settlement. 4 Moravians arrived in Melbourne in 1864. After preparing in Victoria and the Adelaide region, 3 of them settled at Lake Copperamana near Lake Eyre in January 1867. Drought, hostility from settlers and proximity of the nearby Lutheran at Lake Kililpanina Mission led to their withdrawal in 1869. Lake Copperamana became an outstation of the Lutheran mission. One of the 4 missionaries didn't actually get to Lake Copperamana because those Cornish people at Wallaroon-Kanina snaffled him, and he started what we now know as Point Pearce settlement, Point Pearce mission formerly, and it was the York Peninsula Native Mission, and that was the Reverend Kuhn. A group of approximately 50 Moravians were among German immigrants who came to South Australia in 1851. Having settled in Gawler and Tanunda, they moved to Light Pass. While they associated with the Lutheran Church, they valued their Moravian identity and wrote to the Moravian Synod in Saxony, requesting a pass to be sent to minister to them. This was approved in January 1853, and Pastor Christoph Schondorf arrived in 1854, preached in a temporary church near Light Pass. Schondorf envisaged establishing a Moravian diaspora community modelled on Herrnhut, which he had visited in 1853. He wished to change the nature of Moravian settlement in South Australia from being members of a congregation, a Landgemeinde, to belong to a settlement, an Ortsgemeinde, a more closed, where the Landgemeinde was a group in a town and they just had their church. But a settlement where they would run everything was this Ortsgemeinde. The former term referred to residents in a town amongst non-Moravians. In an Ortsgemeinde, the members lived, worshipped and worked in a Moravian-only space. The other Moravian congregation was at South Kilkerran, near Maitland. In 1872, a small congregation met. 70 members joined the Lutheran Church. So this congregation was an example of a Moravian congregation or Landgemeinde. Bethel Church and Cemetery, with the assistance of a loan from George Fife Angus, who you've probably heard of, Schondorf purchased 1,912 acres of farmland approximately 10 kilometres northwest of Kapunda for £3,445. Most of this area was divided into 11 lots, which he sold to members of the community for £2 per acre, probably worth a bit more now. He retained 70 acres of this. The settlers ploughed the land. A church building with a thatch roof opened in 1856. He commenced a school with 38 pupils in the school building. Feeling the need for support of a wife to share responsibility, he asked the Comezzi family for permission to propose to their only daughter. This was granted, and they married on his 44th birthday, 1858. In August 66, the 3 Moravian missionaries going to Lake Coppermine passed through that way, and a young member of the Bethel community, Johann, it's G-E-U-E, Gui, I think it's Gui, who came to Australia with his family in 1855 at the age of 18, accompanied these 3 for a while to assist them handle horses in Australian conditions. Although Schondorf reported that everybody at Bethel seemed happy, a somewhat grave situation was to cloud relationships in the community a decade later. Other German settlers in the district began attending Moravian services and mingling with members in their homes. Non-Moravian religious observances displeased Schondorf. He told those involved that they would have to leave the Moravian Church. Complaints were made about Schondorf retaining so much land in his name. The complaint was taken to the Supreme Court in 1869 but rejected. However, Schondorf wrote of the physical and spiritual strain caused by this affair, which contributed to his request to the Synod in Herrnhut to send an assistant. In response to this, Pastor Anton Jacobi, Pastor Anton Jacobi and his wife arrived 30th of June 1876. Elders advised the Schondorfs to take a break. They travelled by steamer to Melbourne. Schondorf visited the Moravian settlement at Ebenezer and Rummayuk. Returning, he believed that Jacobi could manage on his own. Feeling spiritually tired, he preached his last sermon to the congregation, 31st December 1876. Following day, Jacobi preached his first sermon as sole minister. A new building for both church and school erected in 1876, the former building becoming the manse. Schondorf built a house on land opposite the church. However, another grave situation developed as Schondorf found it difficult to surrender the reins completely. Again, sounds like Labor politics, doesn't it? He baptised one of his children in 1877 and asked Jacobi to record it in the church register. Jacobi refused, and as the dispute widened, he expelled Schondorf from the congregation. Schondorf continued holding services in his home, giving confirmation instruction to his followers' children. In response to Jacobi's complaint, the Moravian authorities in Herrnhut wrote to the Bethel congregation in January 1878, advising that Jacobi was the only legal pastor. Schondorf and his followers defied this ruling. They would not be regarded as members of the Moravian community. Schondorf continued to conduct services and wedding ceremonies. The breakaway group established their own cemetery near his house. According to one report, this strained relationship continued until 1887, when the missionary Hagenauer visited Bethel and brought about some reconciliation between the parties. The ruins of Schondorf's house with the nearby cemetery in which he is buried still stand today as a reminder both of his commitment to the establishment and nurture of the community and of the tensions which developed. Jacobi continued his ministry till his death in 1891. He was buried in the Bethel Cemetery. In 1892, Pastor Paul Buck arrived from Germany. A new church building was opened in 1895, and that I think would be the building we saw earlier. Members excavated stone in local quarries, brought it to the site in wagons. These workers included Wilhelm Arnold, Heinrich Peltz, Albert Vogt, and Albert Linke. Names, their descendants would be quite familiar. Lime and bricks were brought from Gawler. Buck returned to Germany in 1907. The 3 Moravian pastors baptised 583 children. Throughout their period, the pastors and their wives were in charge of the school. As requests of the Moravian Church in Saxony for replacement were unsuccessful, the congregation applied membership of the Emmanuel Synod of the Lutheran Church in 1907. That was the site of one of the church buildings. As the first presentation of this paper, or previous draft of this paper, of the Friends of the Lutheran Archives in Adelaide in May last year, descendants of some of the Moravians came down from Kapunda way and offered insights into the way in which some of the Moravian traditions identified earlier in this paper were maintained at Bethel. Although the choir system was not fully implemented, it was expressed in 2 customs. The division between single and married women was exemplified in that single women were dressed in clothing in which the colour pink predominated, whereas married women's clothing tended towards red tonings. Males and females entered and left the church at Bethel through different doorways. My research into this history was aided in that some of the Bethel Moravians followed the practice of writing their life story, this Lebenslaufe. For example, the brief autobiographies of Schondorf and Guri provided useful details. I'm grateful for Lyle Cookey from the Lutheran Archives for help he's given me in digging out some of these materials. Felicity Jentz, who's of German descent, not Moravian, and her father owns the farm next to Ebenezer mission site in Victoria, in an article on the Moravians at Bethel, focused on ways in which migrant communities maintain their identities in colonial situations, not only as Europeans, but also as smaller, self-identifying communities. She concluded as follows, and I'm concluding in half a tick. This example of the Moravians in Bethel adds to our knowledge of how transnational connections shape the history of South Australia. It provides insight into the ways in which cultural and religious traditions continue to be maintained in the colonial world, and how the differences between Europeans provided another avenue for small cultural groups to define themselves in opposition to the dominant culture, and in doing so allowed such groups to continue to reinforce and maintain their own unique identities. The layout of the Bethel Cemetery and the type of gravestones in it are an expression of this maintenance of cultural identity. As intimated in the introduction to this paper, on a visit to Bethel in 2009, I was fascinated by the way in which the cemetery portrays the change from Moravian to Lutheran traditions. The Moravian section is laid with the simple flat tombstones as at Herrenhut and Bethlehem. Now they're not quite like that because of where they've put little markers on them now, so they're not quite the things, but traditionally they were. Previously they were. The Lutheran section shows the development of the more elaborate raised memorials common to most cemeteries in the European tradition. This paper is a journey through history in which visits are made to significant Moravian cemeteries to identify particular elements of their traditions and values. This may enable visitors to Bethel to view both the church and cemetery from a wider historical perspective with a deeper understanding of their history. This man, Frank Villier, ends his article on cemeteries in America with the comment, "Cemeteries as the visual and spatial expression of death may tell us a great deal about the living people who created them." This certainly applies to the Bethel and other Moravian cemeteries, which have been the focus of this paper. Thanks for your patience. I think I'm a bit over time. A lecture I gave to the Uniting Church Historical Society back in 1999, but they tell me it's the best seller they've ever had. It's available for $4. And it's a history of the Moravian Aboriginal mission work. And there's a few copies left, I think, but it's $4, which goes to the Uniting Church Historical Society.
Have we got any questions for Bill?
I find it curious, the transition from Moravian to Lutheran. Was it simply that there were no, sort of they all intermarried, or was there a date that they said, right, tomorrow you're Lutheran, we're going to bury you as a Lutheran, or was it a slow transition from one to the other?
I suppose there was some foretaste of this in what was happening with Schondorf's experience when he was there, and some of the people started to mix with the other German people there, so there was a bit of mixing. But I think in the end, it was the problem of a Moravian kind of Ortsgemeinde, this kind of close community surviving so far from Herrenhut in Saxony, from their synod and their leadership, and without any other support round Australia. There were the only two congregations, and the South Kilkerran one was different. And I think it was just pressure because of the surroundings they were in. And it was probably a slow progress. And it was a problem then, they had a job recruiting another pastor to come, so they decided to throw in their lot with the Lutherans.
Bill, to follow that on, did the Moravians use any, translations or whatever that Luther had put together, or would they have their own versions of the liturgy, etc.?
I think they took things from other Protestant groups, but largely of their own making. They have their own books. They have a little daily watch thing they put out that goes around the world of readings and so forth. So they would have drawn on it to some degree, but they had their own specific resources.
Can you tell us whether the Moravians are still existing in what was East Germany, Saxony and Czechoslovakia?
Herrenhut is still pretty much a Moravian village, as I say, it's only about 1,500. Delightful place. When we went there in 1998, just had a few days there. And fortunately, there was a Dutchman, because they had a centre, one of the early places. They had them in Holland and England, as I said, Yorkshire, and in Netherlands. And the fellow in charge of the archive was Dutch, and he was able to interpret, because I don't have German. And we found it a bit strange. 1998 was only a few years after the fall of the wall, and there was an attitude there, a bit of suspicion, I think, of strangers generally. They didn't come out warmly and welcome you. The people in the archive were good, but we depended a lot on this Dutch person. They had suffered a lot. It was interesting because they'd run the education, they'd run homes and all kind of things, but the communists took that all over, and they really suffered a lot. And there was only one thing that was still there that they ran, and it was a home for children with problems. And you'd go past that building, you'd go, oh, what would happen with children who were disadvantaged, and communists didn't want to know anything about them, and the Moravians kept a home for them. But yes, they still have a synod meeting there. There are a couple of other centres around there. As I say, the world membership's not very strong because they didn't look to build a new denomination, but there's still the Moravian Church still goes on there, and the archive is a very interesting place with all the resources they have. Hope that answers.
Anyone else?
The two missions that you spoke of up at Lake Eyre, Kapunda and the other one, how far apart were they in there?
Only about 20, 25 kilometres. They weren't far apart at all. It was interesting, as I said, the Moravian one was inspired, motivated by people in Victoria because of John King, and there was a swell of goodwill towards these Deary people up there, and they wanted to do something, but they didn't really consult with South Australia. And although the men who came out trained a bit over there was drought up there, and that hindered the opening. But one of them spent a bit of time down at Point Macleay with a missionary down there, and one spent a bit of time where they started Point Pearce, and they spent a bit of time at Bethel while they waited. But the Lutherans here had decided to start a mission at the same time. And when the Moravians were getting up near that, at one station, they met a policeman. And he said, when the Lutherans went up, this policeman said, there's another group of missionaries went up here a month ago. Neither seemed to know about it. And it's very interesting to read the correspondence. People like Reverend F.W. Cox, who's well-known congregational, and he was interested in Aboriginal affairs. He was writing letters about, as these blooming Victorians getting mixed up in South Australia business. I mean, things haven't changed. And so they were quite close together. And they cooperated a bit, but things were tough. They had to withdraw for a while because there'd been Aboriginal people killed at Lake Hope Station, and Aboriginal people were getting a bit testy and threatening white people, and so the Moravians withdrew to a station for a while. So, and then they did go back, but they could see there was no sense in both of them being there, and they withdrew.
My question was their choice of locality of Ebenezer in Victoria and then Bethel here.
Yeah.
Why did they select those particular areas? Were there congregations of Lutherans that invited them, or what would that be?
Now, that was an Aboriginal mission established, and it was largely at the behest of Anglicans and Presbyterians and others, not Lutheran. Because the Moravians were open. They didn't, as I said, they wanted to come in and kind of renew existing fellowships. And they'd had this failed attempt at Lake Boga, and there were some people up round the Wimmera who, one man especially, who had had a bit of an affair mistreating Aborigines, but he had a kind of conversion from that, and he encouraged them to come up and offered some of his land. So it was a mixture of people in Melbourne and people in the Wimmera who said this would be a good site. It was on a river, bend of the river, and so that's why they had to look at a few sites and selected that site. And that mission, it was one of the first to continue for about 50 years. Others had failed. The other that continued for a while about the same time was the one over near Port Lincoln. The name just... Penindi, yes. It started about the same time. They're the first two that survived, but Penindi not as successfully as Ebenezer. For Bethel, well, they went up to where the German, the Barossa area, and Lights Pass and so forth, but when they wanted to separate, they looked round the area, and why they just chose that, probably the land was available, and Schondorf selected it, and with the assistance, as I say, of George Fife Angus.
Thanks, Bill. I'd like to call on Adrian Brown to give a vote of thanks.
Earlier this evening, which is why I'm wearing a suit, I was representing the Society at a reception related to the history conference, and of course it's a special one this year because we're up to 175 as in our history, and it seems to me most appropriate that tonight, Bill, you've been talking about what could easily be regarded as a very obscure group, but a very important one. Bill and I actually are colleagues. He comes from the Presbyterian side and I come from the Methodist side, so I was actually waiting to see whether you're going to get in the bit about the Moravians and John Wesley, so you got a tick for that. But their influence really was way, way beyond their numbers. Yes, yes. And certainly that was true in South Australia as well, even though they were just sort of popped into a couple of spots. So I think it's really been very important for us tonight to be aware of how our heritage has been shaped in so many different ways, not the least by which some groups might be regarded as being obscure, but we thank you for helping us to expand our knowledge and to understand just a little bit more about the heritage which is ours, especially in this 175th year. So thank you very much.